on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard R.J. Eskow. I have yet to meet anyone who has told me, who has to take any kind of prescription medication, who has said, hey, it's great, it's affordable, no problem with it. I suppose if you just, have one set of antibiotics or something, it's okay, but a lot of people are out there with chronic illnesses. A lot of people are out there are being exploited and troubled and even harmed and killed by the runaway costs of prescription medications in this country. My next guest, I always look forward to speaking with her, is the executive director of Patients for Affordable Drugs, which I believe can be found at patientsforaffordabledrugs.org. And she's here to talk with us, first of all, about a report they recently completed, and secondly, about an update on the 1-year anniversary of the Inflation Reduction Act. So without any further ado, Meredith Basey, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. Good to see you.
We're always delighted to have you. I'm going to actually switch it around. I'm going to start with, as we record this, which is on Wednesday, the whatever it is, 16th, I guess, it is the 1-year anniversary of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. The one provision in it that I could find that could clearly reduce inflation is its provision to begin the process of negotiating drug prices for Medicare. So I guess maybe for those who might not be clear on that, would you mind giving us just like a quick update on what the IRA says about drug prices and what we can expect in the coming months?
Sure, thank you. So quick summary, I'll do my best. To start with, so the Inflation Reduction Act, as you said, was passed last year. Today's the 1-year anniversary, and we are celebrating this important milestone. Some of the first provisions that came in that are already helping people, but it's people on Medicare, just to be clear. We're looking to work to expand this beyond people just on Medicare, right? But this is an important step forward. So from January 1 of this year, people on Medicare can get free vaccines. So some vaccines are quite expensive, like shingles. They can be like $200+. So that's a specific saving. And then now people who need insulin have had their co-pays capped at $35. So this is just, again, for people on Medicare. It's not the entire population, but it's an important step forward. I will say with the other provisions coming forward, we know that one, as you mentioned, negotiating the price of medications for Medicare. This sounds a bit strange, but it is very important because it will be the first time in 20 years that Medicare will actually be able to negotiate with pharmaceutical corporations to lower the price of their most expensive medications. And it's good because something else that's happening today, as you know, multiple pharmaceutical corporations have filed lawsuits to prevent this. They have multiple arguments, but that is a side note, but important one. So you must know that there's something here that's going to be important for people because pharma is already throwing everything they had at this. And just so that you know that if they do try to gum up the works here, this provision that we need for the top, at least for this year, there'll be 10 drugs, the most expensive drugs on Medicare that are paid for by Medicare. Will be announced on September 1, and that process will begin. And by 2026, those new prices would be available for people on Medicare, and it's going to save billions of dollars for patients and taxpayers overall. And then by 2029, that will be the top 60 drugs, right? So just remember that these lawsuits are really right now about, for the most part, just 60 drugs of the thousands that are on the market right now, but these are the most expensive ones and will make a difference for people. And one last thing I should mention, I think that is a key provision that's coming sooner in 2025, is the provision to also help copay cost, the overall reduction. It would be no more than $2,000 for people on Medicare. So right now, people may be paying $6,000 if you have a cancer med, which we can talk about as well. This would help cap that amount annually, so you would not have to pay more than that. Obviously, we would love that to go further, but this is a starting point, and that's why we're celebrating this milestone today.
So, and by the way, some people pay, of course, way more than $6,000 a year.
Yeah,
including present company. But so let's start with it. First of all, and just to be clear, Medicare never negotiated drug prices, but it didn't matter until the last 20 years, right? Because there was no Part D covering Medicare. But part of the politicking around Part D, as I understand it, was, the big contributors or lobbyists, whoever, that it was made clear that we don't want to let you negotiate Medicare, that, we're going to continue to charge what we want to charge. So even after we cap insulin out-of-pocket costs and then later total out-of-pocket costs, unless Medicare can negotiate, they can still take the American people for an enormous ride by charging Medicare itself these huge amounts, which puts a strain on its resources and budgeting and all that. Do I have that part right?
Absolutely. And that's sort of a little bit as well that we touched on in the new report, because some groups that appear to be supporting patients and are not, in fact, what they seem, and are against things like the policies you suggest, that would actually help lower the total list price, which would be beneficial not just for the person who needs the medication, but also for the system as a whole.
And I wanted to ask you, Meredith, about this list of the 10 most expensive drugs. Is it the 10 most expensive in unit price, or is it the 10 most expensive in terms of their overall cost to Medicare, or don't we know at this point?
I think that those negotiations and the final equation is not public knowledge yet, but it will be soon on the 1st of September.
So groups like yours that advocate for affordability and access to medications, it seems to me one battle was won, but obviously, correct me if I'm wrong, one battle was won in that at least we began the process of negotiating these drug prices for Medicare by the inclusion of that provision in the IRA, and it starts with 10 and then it expands, right? So, but it seems to me that there's now, I don't know that it will be a battle, but there's potentially a battle over, will they pick the right drugs, because they have to pick 10, and then it becomes how aggressively will they negotiate. Now, the groups like your advocacy groups and the public at large won't, I guess, have input on what the 10 drugs are. But once they're picked or identified, what's the process for negotiating? How much time and all that happens? Do you know?
I just know the key piece when if everything goes according to the plan laid out, that these prices would be available by 2026, right? So I know that CMS is thinking through this process, and also how they might be able to engage with folks on this, but that will, I think, be shared as we go forward as well.
So virtually everybody in the advocacy and activist community was super happy that these 10 drugs, that this provision was included in the IRA. I'm never satisfied. Even I was happy that, we've started the process, and now they've thrown a wrinkle into it. And today, the 1-year anniversary of the IRA, as I say, August 16th, people are troubled, understandably, about the fact that it would appear that drug companies are doing everything they can to make sure this never comes to light, right?
Yes. So we knew, so this is not surprising. It wasn't like this took us by surprise in any shape or form, that the pharmaceutical industry said that they would throw everything at this to literally gum up the works, slow it down, so that milestone of being able to actually lower the drug prices by 2026 and then going forward to negotiate more would be pushed further and further out. So we need to make sure that we are protecting what we have so far, which is law. This isn't something that hasn't passed yet. This as of a year ago is law, and these provisions come into effect over time. And I mentioned those that have started now, but that is the concern. And we will throw everything that we have in response. So people are organizing. I should say today there is a press conference outside the Chamber of Commerce, because the Chamber of Commerce have also joined this pushback, disappointingly. So they have sided with big business rather than with people in this country who deserve relief from these high drug prices. And so there's a press conference with allies like Public Citizen, like Social Security Works, and our friends at We At Radio who are down there. And 150,000 people have signed a petition already to ask them to drop these lawsuits and just lower their drug prices and not get in the way of Medicare being able to negotiate initially for these specific 60 drugs with the 10 that will be listed in just a couple of weeks.
You know, as a former company president in a past life, private sector company, I would be ticked off if the Chamber of Commerce, it's supposed to represent business interests, was out there representing one business interest at the expense of all the others. I know this is Medicare only, but drug costs are a problem for every employer that offers health insurance, which is, you know, most employers over 400, 500 employees. So it's an interesting example of, I guess, I won't get into the Chamber of Commerce and how they operate, but it's not a good look. But before we move on to the report, because I do want to move on to the report, have you heard any discussion about, one of the fears people have always had, and not unfounded, is that when different sectors of the health economy push prices down, the prices go up somewhere else, kind of bubble effect. Is there anything that would protect the half or 2/3 of the health economy that isn't Medicare or Medicaid? Is there anything to make sure that the drug companies wouldn't just stick it to them harder to, or is that getting too far afield from what you guys do?
No, I mean, we know that they'll do anything for a buck, right? There was a provision that came in also this year with the Inflation Reduction Act that basically helps to penalize drug corporations when they raise the price above the rate of inflation. So, it doesn't help that inflation has been high recently, but, multiple times a year, drug corporations decide to up their prices, and this will help maintain the prices at least stable in the meantime while we're going through this process. I think January, it was something like 1,000 price hikes. So we also at P4AD do look at those price hikes and have historically to keep an eye on those. And we'll be keeping an eye on them too, to make sure that these provisions are actually having an impact, right? Because that's really important. We want to make sure that anything that comes that is targeted to help patients is actually doing that, right?
And we have seen in the past with physician compensation, for example, and with hospital pricing, that when Medicare established that this is a reasonable rate for a medical service, that private sector, insurance companies and so on, I'm no fan of insurance companies, but that they do in fact use that as a baseline, and that does become it's a valuable resource for guys like I used to be, which are on the wrong side of the fight.
Well, I mean, reasonable is a very loose word because when you come from like the UK, for example,
Right, of course.
the idea of actually a reasonable rate is zero. So, it is. But I hear your point for sure.
I laugh now when I think about how one of the pricing targets we used in that industry was reasonable and customary charges. And when I think about it, that's contradictory. What is reasonable versus what is customary in this country are at a complete odds. And Meredith, I can't resist before we move on to the report. I couldn't get over this quote. This was when the Senate was debating renewing the bill that would protect public health and have emergency resources available, whether there was a pandemic or other public health emergency. One of the lobbying groups, BIO, said they will, quote, aggressively oppose reauthorizing this bill if reasonable pricing clauses remain. And I don't think anybody thought about how ridiculous and insane that really is. They're literally saying, if you force us to charge reasonable prices, we would rather let people die. So that's kind of what we're up against. I mean, I don't, right? That
sums up exactly what has been happening in this country for, a good 2 decades. I thought you were going to mention the quote, I think it was Merck, which was one of the first to file a case against some of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. And they said that this was extortion. And you can only think that the only people who are being extorted are the American people, patients, and there's no question about that. So it's totally the reverse. So to your point as well, like this is reasonable. And we have a lot more work to do.
Yeah. Merck's comment reminds me of my big brother used to beat me up every day until finally one day I hit him back. And he looked at me with this like shock and horror and said, "You would hit your own brother?" That's Merck, right? But let's get to the report, because all of this is, if you have asthma, you get these things in the mail, how to use your asthma. Are you doing your peak flow thing? If you have cancer, you go to the oncology center, you get these little handouts, what to do if you have this or that. So everybody thinks, well, isn't that nice? Here's an association that for no money, out of the goodness of their hearts, is helping me. But you guys did a report, I believe, that was about, organizations like that. And I think it was called, I'm looking at it now, New Reach of Pharma's Hidden Hand, Hiding in Plain Sight. It's an update to the Hidden Hand report. It was released this year. Tell us about that report, if you would.
Absolutely, with pleasure. And this ties into what we've already been discussing, right? So who fights back against the Inflation Reduction Act? Who are the groups that are moving, and why are they moving? And for what purpose? And if you follow the money, you'll probably see that a lot of them tie back to pharmaceutical corporations. And I should state here also for the record that Patients for Affordable Drugs does not take any money from pharmaceutical corporations or anyone that benefits from the sale or distribution of drugs. And that's really important to us, and we're very transparent about that. And we encourage others to do the same. So the original report was The Hidden Hand, that came out in 2021. And it looked at like 15 major national groups that many people will have heard of, who are well respected and who do research or do good work to support patients, right? But what we found with those, that they really did not fully disclose where a lot of the money from pharma was coming from, right? And a lot of these groups also supported the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that maybe would cap out-of-pocket costs, but not that big key piece that we've been talking about, negotiating drugs. And then we also looked at 2 other groups that are front groups, essentially, and then these charitable so-called charitable organizations, right, that also will cover patients' out-of-pocket costs, but they won't support, again, negotiating drug prices, lowering costs, and well, I can go into details about that. So that was the original report, and you can start looking at behind the scenes at how much money they receive from pharma, what policy positions they take on lowering drug prices, etc. And then these other groups too, which are AstroTurf groups, and 3 out of 4 of them that we looked at in 2021 were actually for-profit firms who really just advocate for the policies of pharmaceutical corporations, right? So that was the original report. We felt it was really important to add an update this year to that original version, Hiding in Plain Sight, to look at 3 new groups: the Haystack Project, No Patient Left Behind, which sounds important on the front, and then the Community Oncology Alliance, right? But in each case, we found that these financial and sort of staffing or personnel connections, right, that they were directly tied to pharmaceutical companies, corporations, and that influence, or the hidden hand in that sense, clearly impacts the positions that they take in terms of lowering drug prices.
So the original report included a lot of names people would recognize, right? American Cancer Society, American Lung Association, so on. A lot of names people would know. Of the 3 in the amended report, the one that jumped out at me was the one you just mentioned, the No Patient Left Behind. It's a catchy name, right? And I've seen it everywhere. To me, what's insidious about these groups is that whether their names people recognize or not, is that, first of all, they sound to people, if you've got one of those diseases, you get the literature at your doctor's office or it comes in the mail or whatever, you think they're only looking out for your interests, but then they sort of try to subtly play you, or then you see the same name in a press release that's covered in the media that says you might not get the drugs that are keeping you alive if X, Y, and Z happens, and therefore you have to oppose this bill. Do I have it right? Is that kind of how this whole thing works?
Yes, a variation on a theme. I think it depends on the group. The ones that we are most concerning, although they are the ones that we're talking about, right? Either these, what we call AstroTurf, so fake grassroots organizations who present themselves as one thing, but are actually another. And No Patient Left Behind, we call No Pharma Investor Left Behind. Because Peter Kolchinsky, who is the managing partner of RA Capital, it's really like a biopharma venture capital group, is driving that initiative. And really their purpose is primarily to ensure pharma can maintain these unfettered sort of pricing power. And they do have some interesting policy positions on their website, but from the research that we did, we couldn't find any evidence to back those up. So they say drugs should go generic quickly, that sort of thing. But there's very little there to back that up. It's really focused on these other key areas, which would mean protecting high profits for pharmaceutical corporations rather than actually serving the best interests of patients.
And why is it important that people understand what these groups are really doing and who's really behind them?
Well, I think for the other groups, I think that they, like you mentioned, the name, No Patient Left Behind, it sounds very innocuous. Understanding that they may not be who they seem. So this is also really targeting policymakers in particular, that if you're meeting with a group, to understand that just because you have the name patient or you say that you represent patients, there may be more to them than meets the eye. And so we've sort of listed in this report as well some of the questions that we want for policymakers in particular, but also anyone who's engaging with these groups, right? If they come to you or they want to partner with you, or just as an individual too, is to understand how much money these groups are receiving from the drug industry, right? So a number of the groups we listed, sort of these leading national patient organizations, the American Diabetes Association and the American Cancer Society, they do take money from pharma. The question is how much, and how much does it influence their points of view, right? So we want to know how much of that money is proportion, what is the proportion of the total budget? Is it disclosed? That's obviously a good sign too. Like, can we actually find this on your website? Is there drug or industry representation on the board? And then clearly, what are their positions around lowering drug pricing? Copay caps, everybody loves those, including pharma, because they don't actually lower the price of drugs, right? They will help patients to a degree, but they're not going to ultimately shift the system and see that change that we want to see. So that's really what this is about. But I think it's important for folks also to understand sometimes if it could be that a pharmaceutical corporation could pick up the phone and say, hey, we've given you X millions of dollars this year. You better keep quiet on this one particular policy issue where it could actually be in favor of patients. So are they gagged essentially by the role that the money plays? And this is not to take away with the sort of these national patient organizations. A lot of them are doing important work to support patients in different ways, but they're just not tackling this issue of lowering drug prices because they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them.
I think your report categorized the various groups involved in three ways, if I recall correctly. One was respectable organizations that are nevertheless being influenced, which just sounds like this category. Another was front groups for pharmacy, which might be, I don't know, that might be Patients for Affordable Drugs. I don't know. Or no patients. I'm sorry. Yeah. I meant that.
No patients left behind. See, it gets tricky.
Yeah, it gets tricky. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to insult you. And then the third, which I can't remember, but let's take the American Diabetes Association, because I think that's a great case study. This now is going back to your original 2021 report, but I think it's good for a couple reasons. One, everybody knows the name. Yeah. Two, diabetes is a pretty common illness. Three, it's one of the most extreme cases of pharmaceutical industry profiteering, right? Because as those of us who talk about this world know, the original patent for insulin was sold by the three scientists for $1 a piece, so $3, which is about $52 nowadays. Still not a lot for a drug patent. And yet all the manufacturers have increased their prices sort of in concert to extremely high levels. And here's what your report said about the American Diabetes Association, that it receives millions of dollars from pharmaceutical companies, but does not disclose exactly how much they contribute. That 1/3 of the members of its board of directors, at least as of 2021, have financial ties to the pharmaceutical industry. And that despite the high price of insulin, they failed to support recent policy proposals that would allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices for drugs, including insulin. So that to me is a perfect example of things we could do. I don't know what you're thinking is. It seems to me we don't have to negate whatever good work they do in educating people on, wellness programs or whatever, disease maintenance. But they've endorsed. They had endorsed programs to reduce out-of-pocket costs, but that could, if anything, result in increased profits to the drug companies. So one thing that what might help might be disclosure, right? To asking of these groups, particularly because I don't know if these are tax deductible tax deductible contributions. I think if I were to contribute to the American Diabetes Society, it would be tax deductible. There are tax dollars involved. There's public interest involved. Wouldn't it be reasonable to ask these groups to disclose just how much money they're getting from a big pharma?
There's that great word, reasonable again, huh?
Right, that word, yeah, that radical
We're being
word.
reasonable here. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the truth. And as someone who's fought for access to insulin for the best part of 2 decades, I've had personal engagement with the American Diabetes Association when they haven't come out in front on the issue of insulin, which you think would be an obvious move forward. And they have endorsed legislation that would reduce insulin costs and supported Medicare price negotiation, I think back in 2016. But then they haven't necessarily been leading the fight in the way that you would hope for the people that they serve. And this is typical. I do think, and it would be interesting to go back now and take a look at these 15 more legitimate, respected, as you said, organizations, and see if they are now, if they've updated anything since 2021. That could be its own report. But I do think they have failed to sort of call out specific insulin manufacturers, right, about their role in keeping prices high. So again, follow the money. That's all you need to think about. I think really here, as it is with lobbyists on Capitol Hill as well, and politicians too. But I think that's it. You know, as you said, it's important not to undermine the important work they are doing instead of research or support to patients. But it does feel that this is the one area that actually, with the support of these organizations behind something like Medicare negotiation, maybe we would be able to advance much further more quickly if they were willing to also stand up for what is right.
No, that's very well said. But before we go, I do also have to mention the American Lung Association because, I developed asthma when I was 14, and my mother, little, blonde, petite, pearls and everything. I had to go to the hospital. I was lying there, and she held my hand and said, "Don't feel bad, sweetie. Che Guevara had asthma." That was her way of making me feel better because I had long hair and was radical and everything. But the American Lung Association, all as of 2021, all sorts of drug companies contributed, and all 9 members of its health industry council were pharmaceutical company executives. So, I mentioned them partially because all 9 members is a lot, and secondly, because I've gotten their literature, for so many years, and they always say carry your inhaler. I rarely need an inhaler anymore, but of course you have to buy an inhaler, but it's also useful. Spirometer, I don't do that either, but if you need it, it's good to do it. So I guess, again, to me, the takeaway is transparency and, making people aware of what these groups are doing, and maybe a little public pressure not to represent what's supposed to be their real constituency, which is patients, and not others. But that's my closing thought. And before we go, I will give you the last word.
No, I agree. Transparency is critical. It's not enough, but I do think it's really important, especially right now, where we're seeing these lawsuits, where we're seeing this pushback. Whose voice is really represented, and what ties do they have to industry will be something to look for, because their claims may not be legitimate, of course, and we know that. It's clear to us the people who are being hurt are people in this country who've been paying high drug prices for far too long. So we do hope, if there's other people too, if I may do a shout out, like people not just in who speak English, people who speak Spanish. We launched our Medicare negotiation site in Spanish today. We invite people who are experiencing high drug prices to share their stories with us, because that's really what we try to do in the media and on Capitol Hill, is to share stories of people's experiences, to humanize some of these statistics that you just read in the news about, like, oh, X percent, is high. X drug is being increased by Y price. But really, this is about human beings. This is about people being able to access the medication they need to not just survive, but to thrive. So most people in this country support not just these initiatives through Medicare negotiation and the Inflation Reduction Act, but to go further, because 1 in 3 people can't currently afford their medication. So that was a longer wrap up.
No, it was a fine wrap up, and people can find your work at patientsforaffordabledrugs.org. Again, my guest has been Meredith Basey, Executive Director of Patients for Affordable Drugs. Meredith, as always, thanks for all your great work, and as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.